They're really filling them up. They look about ready for winter.
By the last week of October, 17-year-old Caleb Weir had 41 beehives spread across 3 properties on the edge of Lynn County, and every single one of them had started somewhere else, in somebody else's backyard, as a colony that Beekeeper had already given up on. That afternoon, a woman from the extension office stood at the edge of his father's hayfield with a clipboard and a look on her face that Caleb had gotten used to seeing on adults who came out to see the operation for the first time. The particular surprise of somebody who'd expected to find a hobby and instead found something that had quietly become one of the more significant pollination resources in the county. She asked him, eventually, how it had all started, and Caleb told her the same thing he told most people who asked. It hadn't started with a plan. It had started with a wagon, and a winter nobody around here was likely to forget, and a stubborn refusal to believe that a dead hive was necessarily the end of the story. The winter Caleb meant was 3 years earlier, when he was 14, and it had been brutal on the county's beekeepers in a way that took most of them by surprise, even though the warning signs had been building for years. Varroa mites had been chewing through colonies across the region for the better part of a decade by then, a parasite small enough to be nearly invisible but destructive enough to collapse an entire hive if left unchecked, weakening bees and spreading disease through a colony faster than most backyard keepers had the tools or the knowledge to stop. Add in a brutal cold snap that hit in late January, on top of colonies already weakened by mite loads and a light fall nectar flow, and the result was a season that gutted hobbyist beekeeping across 3 counties almost overnight. Beekeepers who'd kept 2 or 3 hives in their backyard for years, more out of enjoyment than any real commercial ambition, walked out that spring to find every single colony dead, and a lot of them, tired and discouraged after years of fighting the same losing battle against mites and disease, decided that spring was the year they finally quit. Caleb's own interest in bees had started well before that winter, in a way that had more to do with a general fascination with how things worked than with any particular love of insects. He'd been the kind of kid who took apart small engines just to see how they went back together, who read library books about ecosystems and food chains for fun rather than for a school assignment, and who'd spent an embarrassing amount of time, according to his mother, standing at the edge of the family garden watching bumblebees work the squash blossoms instead of doing the chores he'd been sent out to do. When a neighbor 2 doors down, a retired schoolteacher named Vernon Hollis, who'd kept bees for close to 20 years, mentioned over the fence one afternoon that he was giving it up after losing every colony that brutal winter. Something in Caleb refused to just let the news pass by the way most 14-year-olds would have. He asked Vernon what happened to the equipment once a beekeeper quit. Vernon told him, with the particular weariness of a man who'd already had this conversation with himself more than once that spring, that it mostly just sat. Some of it rotted behind sheds and barns, some of it got sold cheap to whoever wanted it for scrap lumber, and most of it, if he was honest, would probably end up at the dump eventually, because there wasn't much market for second-hand beekeeping equipment in a county where half the hobbyists had just quit at the same time for the same reasons. Caleb asked if he could have Vernon's old boxes instead of letting them go to the dump. Vernon, more amused than anything else, told him he was welcome to whatever he could haul away, and didn't think much more of it, assuming the boy's interest would fade the way most 14-year-old enthusiasms eventually did. It didn't fade. Caleb borrowed his father's garden wagon that Saturday and made 3 separate trips to Vernon's place, hauling back a total of 6 hive bodies in various states of disrepair, some with rotted bottom boards, one with a colony of mold instead of bees, all of them smelling faintly of old wax and neglect. His father, watching from the porch as his son unloaded the 3rd wagon load into the garage, asked what exactly the plan was, since as far as he could tell, his son had just spent an entire Saturday collecting junk nobody else wanted. Caleb didn't have a fully formed answer that first day, not one he could have explained cleanly to an adult, expecting a practical justification. What he had was a stubborn, half-articulated sense that something as complicated and useful as a honeybee colony shouldn't just be allowed to disappear from the county because the mites had won a few rounds in a row, and that if grown men with 20 years of experience were giving up, that didn't necessarily mean the problem was unsolvable, just that it needed somebody willing to approach it differently. His father, a row crop farmer who understood a certain kind of stubbornness better than most, since farming rewarded almost nothing else quite as reliably, told Caleb he could keep the boxes in the garage through the winter as long as they didn't attract anything worse than dust, and left it at that. Caleb spent the following months doing more reading than he'd ever done for any school assignment, working through library books and university extension publications on Varroa mite biology, colony health, and the specific practices that separated beekeepers, who lost colonies every winter, from the smaller number who managed to keep theirs alive year after year. What he learned, slowly and imperfectly, was that a lot of hobbyist beekeeping in the region had fallen into patterns that made colony loss almost inevitable: inconsistent mite monitoring, treatment schedules based more on habit than on actual mite counts, and a general reliance on buying new package bees each spring to replace whatever had died over winter, rather than working to build colonies genetically capable of surviving on their own. It was, in its way, the same pattern he'd later recognize in plenty of other corners of farming: a slow drift away from resilience and toward dependency on inputs that worked well enough right up until they didn't. He rebuilt his first hive box that winter, with help from a video series he found through the Extension Office's website, replacing rotted wood, scraping and cleaning frames, repainting the exterior with leftover barn paint his father had sitting in the shop. By the time spring came, he had 3 hive bodies in workable condition, cleaned and ready, and absolutely no bees to put in them. That problem solved itself in a way Caleb hadn't fully expected. Vernon Hollis, who'd been watching the boys' progress over the winter, with a mixture of amusement and something closer to genuine interest, mentioned in March that a friend of his 2 townships overkept bees, using techniques focused specifically on breeding for mite resistance, rather than relying on chemical treatments, and that the man occasionally sold small splits, a few frames of bees and a queen, enough to start a new colony, to beginners who showed they were serious enough to be worth the trouble. Vernon offered to make the introduction. Caleb spent his own savings, $60 he'd been putting aside from mowing lawns the summer before, on his first 2 nucleus colonies, and installed them into his rebuilt hive boxes on a cool morning in early April, with Vernon standing beside him, talking him through each step, since Caleb had never actually handled a live colony before that morning, despite the entire winter of reading. The mentor Vernon had connected him with, a man named Otto Kessler, who ran maybe 30 hives on his own property, with a philosophy that leaned heavily on genetics and natural resistance rather than chemical intervention, became the single most important influence on how Caleb's approach to beekeeping developed over the following years. Otto was in his 70s by the time Caleb met him, a retired agricultural researcher who'd spent much of his career working on crop pollination studies before turning his full attention to beekeeping after retirement. And he had strong, well-reasoned opinions about why so much of hobbyist beekeeping in the region was fighting the mite problem with the wrong tools. Chemical treatments worked in the short term, Otto argued, but they also selected, generation after generation, for mites that survived the treatment, while doing nothing to select for bees that could actually defend themselves. What the industry needed, in his view, and what a lot of commercial operations had started paying closer attention to as losses mounted year after year, was bee stock bred specifically for traits like hygienic behavior, colonies whose worker bees were genetically inclined to detect and remove mite-infested brood before the mites could reproduce and spread, essentially handling pest control from the inside without ever needing a chemical treatment at all. Caleb's 2 colonies, sourced from Otto's own carefully selected stock, made it through that first full season without a single treatment, and though he lost one of the 2 to what turned out to be queen failure the following winter, the surviving colony thrived, strong enough by its second summer that Caleb was able to split it into 2 new colonies himself, doubling his count without spending another dollar. It was a small success by any commercial measure, but it confirmed something Caleb had been suspecting since that first winter of reading, that the problem wasn't beekeeping itself, it was the specific practices most hobbyists in the county had drifted into, and that a patient, genetics-focused approach could produce results that chemical-dependent colonies simply couldn't match. Word about what Caleb was doing spread slowly at first, mostly through Vernon and the small local beekeeping association that met monthly at the county extension office, a group that had shrunk considerably over the previous few years, as members aged out or gave up the hobby after repeated losses. By his second full season, Caleb had started attending those meetings regularly, the youngest member by several decades, listening more than he talked at first, gradually earning a kind of respect among the older beekeepers that had less to do with his age and more to do with the fact that his colonies kept surviving winters that were killing off hives belonging to men who'd been keeping bees since before Caleb was born. It was at one of those meetings, in the fall of his second year, that a beekeeper named Ruth Ann Pemberton first asked Caleb whether he'd be interested in taking a few boxes off her hands. She'd kept bees for 11 years, lost her last 2 colonies that summer to a combination of mites and what she suspected was pesticide drift from a neighboring farm's soybean field, and had decided, at 63, that she didn't have the energy left to keep fighting a battle that seemed to get harder every year rather than easier. She had 6 hive bodies sitting empty in her backyard, and no particular use for them anymore. Caleb said yes before he'd fully thought through where he was going to put 6 more hives, and that pattern repeated itself with a handful of other beekeepers over the following 2 years, each one hearing through the same small, tightly connected community that the Weir boy was interested in taking equipment nobody else wanted, each one glad to see their old boxes go to somebody who might actually put them back to use rather than letting them rot. Caleb never paid more than a token amount for any of it, and often paid nothing at all, since most of the beekeepers giving up equipment were simply relieved to have somewhere for it to go besides a burn pile. By the time he was 16, the collection had grown well past what Caleb could manage on the small stretch of ground behind his family's garage, and his father, who'd watched the operation expand from a curiosity into something with real scale over 3 years, agreed to let him set up additional yards on 2 other parcels of the family's land, spaced out enough that the hives wouldn't compete too heavily with each other for the same forage. That was also the year Caleb made the discovery that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in how the whole operation eventually turned out, though it started as something much smaller and much more personal than a business decision. His grandfather, Harlan Weir, had died when Caleb was 9, young enough that Caleb's memories of the man were more impression than detail. The smell of pipe tobacco, a particular laugh, a workshop out behind the old farmhouse that nobody had fully cleared out in the years since. Caleb's father mentioned, almost in passing, one afternoon when Caleb was hauling yet another load of donated equipment through the property, that his own father had kept bees too, decades earlier, before arthritis in his hands had made the work too difficult to continue sometime in the early 2000s. Caleb hadn't known that. Nobody had ever mentioned it, not because it was any kind of secret, just because it was an old fact that had faded out of the family's daily conversation the way old facts do once the person connected to them is gone. Caleb spent the better part of a Saturday going through the old workshop behind the farmhouse, a building his father had mostly used for equipment storage in the years since Harlan's death, and found, stacked in a back corner under a canvas tarp gone stiff with age, 4 hive bodies that had clearly sat untouched for close to 2 decades. The wood was weathered gray. One box had a corner chewed through by whatever animal had gotten into the shed at some point over the years, but the joinery underneath the damage was solid, hand-built rather than store-bought, and stenciled on the side of each box, in lettering gone faint but still legible, was his grandfather's name and a date from 1987. He also found, tucked into a metal toolbox beside the hive bodies, a beekeeping journal in his grandfather's handwriting, kept faithfully for close to 15 years before the entries trailed off sometime in the early 2000s. Caleb read through it that same evening at the kitchen table, and what struck him most, reading his grandfather's careful notes on colony behavior, swarm patterns, and which hives seemed to weather difficult winters better than others, was how much overlap there was between what Harlan had been noticing decades earlier through simple observation and what Otto Kessler had been teaching Caleb through a more formal, genetics-focused framework. His grandfather had never used the term hygienic behavior, wouldn't have known the scientific literature behind it, but there were entries scattered through the journal, noting in his own plain language that certain colonies seemed to clean house better than others and rarely got sick, while other colonies from the same yard struggled every single year no matter what he did for them. He'd been observing the exact trait Otto spent a career studying, 30 years earlier, without ever having the vocabulary to name it. Caleb rebuilt those 4 boxes that winter, with more care than he'd put into any of the others, replacing the chewed corner, resealing the joints, repainting them in a shade of barn red, close to what traces of original paint remained under the weathering. He installed a split from one of his strongest colonies into the first of his grandfather's rebuilt boxes the following spring, and made a point, every time he checked that particular hive afterward, of thinking about the fact that bees were once again living in equipment his grandfather had built with his own hands, on the same ground where Caleb Weir had kept his own colonies decades before Caleb was born. The commercial side of the operation grew alongside the personal one, though Caleb himself would say, if asked, that the two things had never felt fully separate to him. By his second year keeping bees, local orchard owners had started reaching out, first through Otto's connections, later through word of mouth that spread the same way news of his willingness to take unwanted equipment had spread. The county's fruit growers, like fruit growers across a wide stretch of the region, had been feeling the effects of a broader pollinator decline for years, wild bee populations thinning under pressure from habitat loss and pesticide use, commercial honeybee colonies harder to rent for pollination contracts as the same mite pressures that had gutted local hobbyist beekeeping drove up costs and reduced availability nationally. A teenager with a growing number of healthy, locally adapted colonies willing to place hives in an orchard for the bloom period represented exactly the kind of small-scale, reliable pollination resource that a lot of smaller orchard operations, unable to compete for contracts with the large migratory beekeeping operations that served bigger commercial growers, had been struggling to find. Caleb placed his first pollination hives, 6 of them, at a small apple orchard on the north side of the county the spring he turned 16, an arrangement Otto helped him negotiate, since Caleb had no experience setting rates or understanding what a fair pollination contract looked like. The orchard owner, a woman named Diane Castellano who'd been running the operation with her husband for close to 20 years, paid a modest fee for the 2-week placement and reported back at the end of the season that fruit set had been noticeably better than the previous 2 years, when she'd been relying mostly on whatever wild pollinators happened to be working the property. That single successful placement led to 2 more the following spring, then 5, then, by the time Caleb was 17, contracts with 8 different orchards and small diversified farms across the county. Each relationship built the same patient way the rest of the operation had grown, through word passed between neighbors who trusted each other's judgment more than they trusted any advertisement. Caleb kept the pricing modest, more focused on building relationships and proving the value of locally adapted, chemical-free colonies than on maximizing what he could charge, a decision that echoed, whether he fully recognized it or not, the same instinct toward community usefulness over pure profit that had shaped how a lot of the older farmers around him ran their own operations during hard years. The discovery that changed the trajectory of everything happened almost by accident in the summer of his 17th year, during a routine mite check on one of the colonies that had originated from Ruth Ann Pemberton's donated equipment 3 years earlier. Caleb had gotten meticulous about record-keeping by then, another habit Otto had drilled into him from the beginning, tracking mite counts across every colony on a rotating schedule, using alcohol wash sampling, a standard method for estimating mite load in a given hive. Most of his colonies ran counts that required occasional intervention, still far better than the industry average, but not entirely maintenance-free. One colony, though, the one that had come from Ruth Ann's yard, consistently returned numbers close to 0, season after season, no matter how heavily other colonies in the same yard, exposed to the same environmental mite pressure, were struggling. Caleb mentioned the pattern to Otto almost casually at first, assuming it was some quirk of timing or sample error, but Otto's reaction told him immediately that this wasn't something to dismiss. Otto came out to inspect the colony himself the following weekend, spent close to 2 hours watching worker bees on several frames, and pointed out something Caleb hadn't fully appreciated on his own. Worker bees actively uncapping and removing infested brood cells at a rate significantly higher than anything Otto had observed, even in his own carefully selected breeding stock. A textbook demonstration of the hygienic behavior he'd spent decades studying and trying to breed for, occurring naturally in a colony that had originated from equipment a discouraged hobbyist had been ready to throw away. Otto explained, walking Caleb through the implications that afternoon, that this kind of naturally occurring, strongly expressed hygienic trait was exactly what beekeepers and researchers across the region had been searching for, often unsuccessfully, for years. Genetic stock capable of managing mite pressure without chemical intervention, strong enough and consistent enough to be used as breeder queens for raising new queens carrying the same trait forward into other colonies. Where the original genetics had come from was impossible to know for certain, since Ruth Ann herself had never bred her own queens and had likely been running a fairly standard commercial genetic line for most of her 11 years keeping bees. But somewhere in that lineage, whether through natural selection during the same hard winters that had wiped out so many other colonies in the county, or through some combination of factors nobody could fully trace, a genuinely valuable trait had emerged and persisted. Word of the discovery moved through the small regional beekeeping community faster than almost anything else Caleb had experienced in his 3 years keeping bees. Otto brought a colleague from the state's agricultural extension program out to see the colony that same summer, a researcher who specialized in honeybee breeding and pollinator health. And her assessment, delivered with considerably more scientific caution than Otto's initial enthusiasm, but ultimately arriving at the same conclusion, was that the colony represented a genuinely useful discovery for a regional beekeeping community that had been losing ground to mites and colony losses for the better part of 2 decades. She asked Caleb, with his permission and Ruth Ann's blessing, since the genetics had technically originated in her old equipment, even if neither of them could trace the lineage further back than that, to work with the extension program on a small breeding project, raising queens from that colony's genetics to distribute to other beekeepers across the region interested in rebuilding their own operations on more resilient stock. Caleb agreed without much hesitation, though the scale of what that agreement eventually grew into surprised even him. Over the following year, working alongside Otto, and with guidance from the extension researcher, he learned queen-rearing techniques he'd only read about in books before, grafting larvae from the discovered colony into specially prepared cell-builder colonies, raising new queens and distributing them first to other members of the county's small beekeeping association, then further afield as word spread through regional beekeeping networks about a mite-resistant genetic line that had turned up, of all places, in equipment a discouraged hobbyist had been ready to throw away. By the fall of his senior year, Caleb Weir was managing 41 hives across 3 properties, running a modest but genuinely profitable pollination service that served 8 orchards and diversified farms across the county, and had become, almost without meaning to, the regional point of contact for a genetic line of mite-resistant bees that researchers and commercial beekeepers alike were increasingly interested in incorporating into their own breeding programs. Vernon Hollis, the retired school teacher whose discouragement 3 years earlier had started the entire chain of events, had come out of retirement himself the previous spring, inspired enough by what he'd watched Caleb build to start 2 new colonies of his own, sourced, this time, from the same resistant genetic line that had once been sitting, unnoticed, in his own backyard years before he'd given the equipment away. Ruth Ann Pemberton, whose donated boxes had turned out to carry the genetics at the center of the whole discovery, stopped by Caleb's yard that fall to see how the colony descended from her old equipment was doing, and stood at the edge of the hive rows for a long while, the same way Ray Halverson had stood at the edge of a shed full of rebuilt pumps 2 counties over, watching something she'd once been ready to give up on entirely, now doing more good than she'd ever imagined possible when she'd handed those empty boxes over to a 16-year-old 3 years earlier. Caleb never framed any of it, when people asked, as some kind of personal triumph. He talked instead, the way his mentors had taught him to talk about it, in terms of the colonies themselves, of genetics and hygienic behavior and mite counts, careful, methodical language that undersold, in its own way, just how much patience and stubbornness it had taken to get an entire discouraged local beekeeping community to believe in something again. But underneath the technical language was the same instinct that had sent a 14-year-old out with a garden wagon 3 years earlier, refusing to believe that a county full of dying colonies was simply the way things had to be, and willing to spend a winter scrubbing mold out of abandoned hive boxes on the chance that somebody needed to try something different. His grandfather's 4 rebuilt hive boxes were still running strong that fall, 3 full seasons after Caleb had first installed bees into them, the barn-red paint weathering again the way it had weathered the first time around decades earlier. The colonies inside them descended, now, from the same resistant genetic line that had turned Ruth Ann's old equipment into something the whole region had taken notice of. Caleb's father, walking the yard with him one evening that October, stopped at those 4 boxes longer than he stopped at any of the others, and told his son, in the same understated way farmers around here tended to say the things that mattered most to them, that he thought his own father would have found a way to be proud of exactly this, even if Harlan Weir would never have predicted, watching his grandson at 9 years old, that the boy would grow up to save half the county's pollinators with a garden wagon and a stubborn refusal to let a good hive box go to waste. The woman from the extension office, standing at the edge of the hayfield that October afternoon with her clipboard, asked Caleb one more question before she left, wanting to know what came next for an operation that had already grown so far past what anyone, including Caleb himself, had expected 3 years earlier. Caleb told her the truth, which was that he didn't entirely know yet, that he was still working through college applications with an eye towards studying entomology or agricultural science, somewhere that could deepen what Otto and the extension researcher had already taught him, and that whatever came next, he expected it would probably start the same way everything else had started, with somebody nearby giving up on a hive they didn't think was worth saving, and Caleb deciding to find out whether that was actually true. If you want to see which colony Caleb rebuilds next, and whether the resistant genetic line keeps spreading across the county the way it has so far, stick around, because there's a whole region of discouraged beekeepers out there, and Caleb isn't done proving them wrong yet. Ada Voss counted the logs on her porch every night before bed, not the way a woman counts blessings, the way a woman counts something she cannot afford to lose. Nobody in the house thought much of it. Fillmore County, Minnesota, winter of 1911, and old women had their habits. Ada was 71, widowed 9 years, and she kept a woodpile on the wraparound porch that was, by any sane measure, 3 times what one household needed. Her son Walter joked about it at supper more than once, said his mother stacked wood like she was expecting the sun never to come up again. Nora, his wife, thought it was sweet, a widow's way of feeling warm and provided for after losing a husband to a February that never seemed to end. The grandchildren, Teddy and Louisa, liked it for a simpler reason. The porch smelled like split pine and cold bark, and on a good day, grandmother let them stack the small pieces into forts. What none of them noticed, not once, not in 4 winters, was that Ada never let anyone touch the bottom 2 rows. She'd say the bottom logs were too green to burn, or riddled with rot, don't bother, and she'd wave a hand at the stack like it was nothing worth a second look. Teddy, 12 years old and built for restlessness, tried once to pull a log from the bottom row to whittle into a slingshot handle. His grandmother's hand closed around his wrist so fast and so hard he dropped it. "Not those," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He never tried again. The ice came on a Tuesday, the 9th of January, and it did not announce itself the way storms usually do in that part of the country. No wind first, no warning drop in the glass. It just started, a fine gray drizzle at 4 in the afternoon, that by 6 had turned the porch rail to glass, and by 9 had turned the whole world outside the windows into something that clicked and groaned instead of a night sky. By midnight, the telephone wire outside the Voss farmhouse had snapped clean under the weight of ice, the sound sharp as a rifle shot, close enough that Louisa woke up screaming that someone was shooting at the barn. Walter went out with a lantern to check the animals and came back with his mustache frozen white, and a report that 3 fence posts had gone down under the weight of ice on the wire, and that the barn roof was groaning in a way he didn't like. They fed the stove hard that night, harder than any night that winter. And it was somewhere past 1 in the morning, with the wind starting to find its voice and the windows rattling in their frames, that Nora came into the kitchen and said the thing that would end up unraveling 4 years of her mother-in-law's carefully kept quiet. "We're low," she said. "The bin's near empty. Somebody needs to go out to the porch stack." Ada was standing at the stove at the time, and Teddy would remember for the rest of his life the exact half-second in which his grandmother's spoon stopped moving in the pot. "I'll go," Ada said, too quickly, already reaching for her shawl. "You'll break your hip on that ice," Walter said. "Teddy, get your coat." Here is what a boy notices. At 12, in the dark, with ice needling sideways into his collar and a lantern throwing more shadow than light, he notices that the porch, which he has walked across 10,000 times, feels different, underfoot, near the far end, close to where the big logs sit. A give in the boards, a hollow sound where there should be solid sound. He noticed it because the ice had made everything slower, more deliberate, and because his boot caught wrong at the exact spot his grandmother always stood guard over. He set the lantern down to grab an armful from the top rows first, the one she always let them burn. His breath came out in a ragged cloud, and somewhere under the porch floor, not beside him, not behind him, underneath, something moved. Not a rat. Rats don't sigh. Teddy stood very still. The ice ticked against the porch roof above him in a sound like fingernails, patient and unhurried, and beneath his boots came the sigh again, longer this time, and then 3 knuckles worth of a knock, soft, deliberate against wood. He did not scream. He would tell people later that he didn't understand yet why he didn't scream, except that some old animal part of him understood before his mind did that whatever was under that porch was not a thing to be screamed at. It was a thing that had been waiting a long time for someone, anyone, to knock back. So he did. 3 knocks, soft, on the boards. The hollow sound answered him. He went and got his grandmother instead of his father. He never fully explained why, not even years later, except to say that some part of him already understood the answer belonged to her first. Ada came out onto the porch in her nightdress and shawl, with no argument left in her, no story ready. Teddy watched something in her face give way the same as the ice-slicked boards had given way under his boot. Not a collapse, exactly. More like a woman setting down something she'd been carrying so long her arms had forgotten they were tired. She knelt at the bottom row of logs, the 2 green, the riddled with rot, and began pulling them aside one by one with her bare hands, ice water running off the wood and down her wrists, until a plank of the porch floor came away in her grip and showed a black square underneath, a hatch no wider than a washtub, cut into the foundation itself. "Silas," she said, down into the dark. "It's Ada. Come up now, it's time." What came up out of that hole, slow and stiff with cold, blinking against lantern light he clearly hadn't seen in longer than made sense, was a man of maybe 25, thin in the particular way of someone who has been fed just enough, and no more. A beard gone ragged, eyes that found Teddy's face and went wide with something between fear and disbelief, as if he'd expected, after all this time, that the person who finally opened that hatch might not be a friendly one. "This is your cousin," Ada said to Teddy, in a voice gone flat with exhaustion and relief both. "Silas Rayburn. My sister Eda's boy. You've never met him, because I told your father he died in a logging accident up near Duluth 6 years ago." Teddy said nothing. There was nothing in him built yet to hold what he was hearing. "He didn't die," Ada said. "I lied to your father, because it was safer for Silas if even we believed it." The story came out over the next hour, in the kitchen, with Walter standing by the stove with his arms crossed so tight it looked like he was holding his own ribs in place, and Nora with both children pulled against her, and Silas wrapped in every blanket in the house, drinking broth, with hands that shook too hard to hold the cup without help. 6 years back, Silas Rayburn had been 19 and working a logging camp outside Duluth, and he'd witnessed his camp foreman beat a Finnish laborer half to death over a wage dispute. Beat him bad enough the man lost an eye. Silas had been the only one willing to say so out loud to the camp inspector who came through weeks later. The foreman's family had money and a judge in their pocket in that county, and inside of a month, the story had flipped entirely. It was Silas, they said, who'd started the fight. Silas who'd nearly killed a man. There was a warrant, and there was talk, real talk, credible talk, that if he was caught, he wouldn't make it to a cell. He'd be handled quietly on the road first, the way men sometimes were handled in those camps, when the wrong family wanted it done. He'd run. He'd made it as far as his Aunt Ada's porch in Fillmore County, half-starved, in the dead of a November night, and he'd begged her not to tell a soul, not even her own son, because the fewer people who knew, the fewer people could be made to answer questions about him under oath, or under pressure, or under a bottle of whiskey and a persuasive lawman. So Ada had dug out an old root cellar entrance that had been sealed since her husband's time, deepened it herself with a shovel over the course of one brutal week, and told her nephew to stay under that porch until she found a way to clear his name properly, a way that wouldn't put her son's family at legal risk for harboring him, a way that wouldn't put Silas back in a county where a foreman's family owned the judge. The firewood had never been about cozy nights. It had been cover, camouflage, and, twice a week, when she brought food and thick socks and news down through that hatch, under cover of checking on the rot, it had been the only lifeline a wrongly accused boy had left in the world. 4 years, Walter finally said, when she'd finished. His voice cracked on the number. 4 years, and you never told me. Because you'd have wanted to do the right thing, Ada said, meeting her son's eyes without flinching. And the right thing, done too soon, would have gotten him killed. The ice storm did not let up for 2 more days, and in a strange way, it was the storm itself that ended up saving Silas rather than exposing him to ruin. The same wire that had come down and stopped news from traveling in also meant no lawman was coming out from town in this weather, no judge, no witness, nobody at all. The whole county sealed shut under glass, and inside that seal, Ada Voss finally had the thing she'd never had in 4 years of secrecy. A full room of family, gathered around a table, unafraid to speak Silas's name out loud. Walter sat with the problem the way he sat with a stubborn fence post, turning it over until he found the give in it. By the second night, he remembered something. A lawyer out of Rochester, a man named Halloway who'd once helped a neighbor overturn a false conviction on a land dispute, working pro bono for veterans and laborers who'd been cheated by moneyed men. When the wires went back up 11 days later, that was the letter Walter sent first. Before the seed order, before anything. It took the better part of that year. A hearing, 2 witnesses from the old logging camp finally willing to talk once they heard Silas hadn't run because he was guilty, but because he was scared. A foreman's reputation that had already started to sour on its own for other reasons in other counties. But by the following winter, Silas Rayburn walked into Fillmore County under his own name, in daylight, on the front road, and nobody came for him. Teddy asked his grandmother, much later, why she'd never told even him, a boy who'd shared that porch with her every day for years, who'd stacked wood at her side 100 times without knowing what he was really building. Ada thought about it a long while before she answered, long enough that Teddy figured she wasn't going to. A secret only stays a secret as long as the fewest hands are holding it, she finally said. I wasn't protecting it from you, Teddy. I was protecting you from it. There's a difference. And someday you'll be old enough to feel it. She never did explain, in so many words, what 4 winters of that had cost her. The nights she'd stood at that hatch in weather no old woman should be out in. The lies she'd told her own son at his own supper table. The sound of a shovel against frozen ground, that first November, when she'd carved out a hiding place for a boy she loved more than her own comfort. What she did, instead, the following autumn, was something smaller. Something Teddy never forgot. She had Walter build a proper root cellar the ordinary way. A real door, level ground, no hatch, no lie required to explain it. And on the porch that winter, for the first time in 4 years, she let the boys stack the wood exactly where they wanted, however tall they liked. No rows kept off limits, no logs too green to touch. Teddy asked her once, stacking beside her in the cold, breath fogging between them, why she seemed so much less careful about it now. Ada looked at the porch a long moment, at the ordinary firewood, plain and unguarded, doing nothing now but exactly what firewood is supposed to do. Because for the first time in a long time, she said, there's nothing left under there worth hiding. She picked up the next log and set it on the pile herself.